Yes, this morning we're going to continue our talk with our discussion of Jijuyu Zanmai, the Jijuyu Zanmai section of Bendowa. So, we're talking about this person, this piece, where it says, there is a path through which the Anuttara Samyak Sambodhi of all things returns to the person in Zazen, and whereby that person and the enlightenment of all things intimately and imperceptibly assist each other. So we've kind of gone into the section where he starts talking about, on almost a kind of relative term at times, a relative perspective of how Zazen is the mutual assistance between the person sitting and all dharmas or all things. And he still, jumps back from all these different perspectives, but this is kind of the theme, of this particular part. So he says, then therefore this Zazen person without fail drops off body and mind, cuts away previous tainted views and thoughts, awakens genuine Buddha Dharma, and so forth. He goes on a bit from here. So this part, as you imagine, it's a very important part to talk about. Dropping off body and mind is a key element in Dogen Zenji's teaching. So I'd like to talk about that this morning mainly. I know that we've spoken of it before many times, but it's something that we can, continue to explore over and over again. So I think, when he uses this term, he's sort of favoring the perspective, of the person sitting. We have to take some kind of perspective when we talk about practice and when we talk about Zazen, although it's, ultimately beyond any perspective, but we have to, of course, in human language, take some perspective. But as I often say, the difficulty with Dogen Zenji's teachings often is that he's jumping around unexpectedly from different perspectives, and he doesn't necessarily clue us in, when he's changing. And that's because the boundaries between these perspectives are really, pretty fluid. And anyway, so first of all, I'd like to talk about, or I'd just like to talk about how the Buddha talked about dropping off body and mind, I think, or where this saying really comes from. And I often mention this, but this is just a short passage from the Samyutta Nikaya, the Pali Canon, and the Buddha says, "At Savatthi, monks, I will teach you the burden, the carrier of the burden, the taking up of the burden, and the casting off of the burden. Listen and pay close attention. I will speak." "As you say, Lord," the monks responded. The Blessed One said, "And which is the burden? The 5 clinging aggregates, or the 5 skandhas?" It should be said, which 5? Form as a clinging aggregate, feeling as a clinging aggregate, perception as a clinging aggregate, fabrications as a clinging aggregate, consciousness as a clinging aggregate. This, monks, is called the burden. So, these are just, of course, the 5 skandhas that he's, Thanisaro Bhikkhu has translated them as aggregates here. And then this part, which is kind of problematic in the teaching, sort of apparently like a very controversial passage that we won't talk about, but philosophically is been discussed a lot over the ages. He says, and which is the carrier of the burden? The person, it should be said. This venerable one with such a name, such a clan name, this is called the carrier of the burden. And which is the taking up of the burden? The craving that makes for further becoming, accompanied by passion and delight, relishing now here, now there. In other words, craving for sensual desire, pleasure, uh, sensual pleasures, craving for becoming, craving for non-becoming. This is called the taking up of the burden. And which is the casting off of the burden? The remainderless fading and cessation, renunciation, relinquishment, release, and letting go of that very craving. This is called the casting off of the burden. So there's a little verse after this that just kind of recaps. But I found it interesting, that in this translation, he called it the casting off of the burden, the translation. And some translations of Shinjin Datsuraku are casting off, body and mind. So I think that's, what Dogen Zenji is talking about, the letting go of body and mind, because, one of the skandhas is body or form. The difference between the, form of the body and outside of the body is never really distinguished in the Buddhist teaching, I think. But so form is the body and the mind are the other four skandhas. So the Buddha is saying casting off the five skandhas is one way to speak about awakening. And that's, I think, what Dogen Zenji is saying, is dropping off body and mind. So to me, sometimes it's important to talk about these things because you have the teaching out there, like Wolf was saying on Reddit probably, or some other of these forums, that Dogen Zenji is, or Zen in general, is not Buddhism, or is something, completely, some complete kind of innovation that was, he's just trying to remake the Dharma completely in some other image that's culturally bound or something like that. And I think, referencing these kinds of suttas and teachings bring us back to the important point that that's not so. Dogen Zenji was very aware of what he was saying in relation to what it means in the context of the Buddhist teaching. And the next part that I'll read, I think, really emphasizes that too. This next part I would like to read is from Hokyoki, which is, Dogen Zenji's record of his meeting or his time. And part of it is his record with his meeting with his teacher, Tiantong Rujin. And so these are the places where Dogen Zenji talks about, dropping off body and mind in most detail and what it means as far as what he experienced in China as dropping off body and mind. And later, Keizan Joking, who was a student of Dogen Zenji's student, wrote, in the transmission of the lamp about this experience of Dogen Zenji dropping off body and mind in the Zendo when he heard his teacher talk about, Shinjin Datsuraku. But Dogen Zenji never wrote about that experience, or nobody who was alive with him at that time, wrote about that. So some scholars really just think that that somehow is not historically accurate. Anyway, someone came up with it, obviously, but it wasn't. It seems, in my teacher's opinion, many others, it wasn't Dogen Zenji's experience, or he never wrote of that. So anyway, what he did talk about with his teacher of dropping off body and mind is very different. So in this is the first part that I'll read about, Dogen Zenji's experience with his teacher and talking about dropping off body and mind. So, Dogen Zenji is asking him, well, I'll just start here. Rujing said, San Zen is dropping off body and mind. We don't use incense burning, making prostrations, nembutsu, reciting Buddha's name, the practice of repentance, or reading sutras. We only engage in just sitting. Dogen asked, what is dropping off body and mind? Rujing said, dropping off body and mind is Zazen. When we just practice Zazen, we part from the 5 desires and remove the 5 coverings. Dogen asks, if we part from the 5 desires and remove the 5 coverings, we follow the same teachings as those of the teaching schools and are therefore the same as practitioners of the Mahayana and the Hinayana. So this is an interesting part because Dogen Zenji is saying he's going to this great teacher and thinking that he's going to give him something different than what he was taught in the tradition that he was ordained in, the Tendai teaching. And in Tendai teaching, it very clearly has a list of the sort of most deep practices. So it never negated, any other Buddhist practice. Tendai teaching doesn't say it's the only teaching. It just says that it's the most profound and deep one. In my understanding, I haven't really studied it, but but it lists all the other, at least in this particular lineage that Dogen was in, it lists all the other, schools and how, according to how deep they are. And so the early Buddhism is considered not so deep, and you get to the top of the list and you get to the authentic or the most deep teaching of the Tendai teaching. And Dogen Zenji was thinking, he was going to find something else because he was dissatisfied with that kind of teaching or with those teachings of the Tendai school that taught about, original enlightenment. And so here his teacher says that actually the teaching school and, early Buddhism, all of those things are authentic teachings of the Buddha. And, when he says the Hinayana, of course, that's a term that used to be used as the lesser vehicle. The, Mahayana Buddhists invented that to say that, there were other schools that were less than the great vehicle. And this is a reference, of course, to the Lotus Sutra, where there's, the two lesser vehicles and the one great vehicle is what is expounded in the Lotus Sutra. And that one great vehicle is actually all, includes all schools or all of Buddhism or really all of reality when we really start getting into it. I think, in my opinion, part of the teaching is that every moment is a Dharma teaching, and every, reality, every form of reality or every moment experience is part of this one vehicle, which is opening up to us to allow us to awaken. But the traditional way of teaching it is that, the early Buddhists were that was kind of Buddha's skillful means. That was his way of allowing some people to connect who wouldn't really understand the deepest teachings if he had given them that. There's the parable of the burning house, and we won't go into that now, but that's all connected with the father just kind of telling the children a white lie to get them out of the burning house of samsara, and by saying that you have these other vehicles that you can play with or that you can connect with to get them out, so that they would actually get this one vehicle that is the true vehicle of awakening. And so Rujing is referring to that and saying, how can any of these teachings of the Buddha not be real, or not, how can we throw overboard the teachings of the Buddha? So he continues and says, the ancestors, or the descendants of the ancestor or Bodhidharma, should not dislike the teachings of the Mahayana and the Hinayana. If a practitioner is against the sacred teachings of the Tathagata, how can such a person be a descendant of the Buddhas and ancestors? So if you don't accept the early canon, of what the Buddha taught, how can you say that you're a Buddhist? Dogen asked, in recent times, some skeptical people say that the three poisonous minds are themselves Buddha Dharma, and the five desires are themselves the way of the ancestors. They say eliminating them is equal to making preferences, and therefore the same as Hinayana practice. So here he's kind of going back to what traditionally is said as his question, is that the original Enlightenment teaching is everything is perfect as it is. Why do we have to practice? And there was a teaching in his time of just saying, all you have to do is realize that everything is enlightened, and then you're okay. Just be natural, do whatever you want to do. You don't have to practice. And so this is the kind of question that he's posing, to his teacher. And his teacher says, if we don't eliminate the three poisonous minds and the five desires, they're the same as the non-Buddhists in the country of King Bimbisara and his son Ajisatu during the time of Shakyamuni. For the descendants of Buddhas and ancestors, removing even one of the five coverings or one of the five desires is of great benefit. It is meeting the Buddhas and ancestors. So, it's making it clear here that he's talking about traditional Buddhist teachings. He's not talking about throwing overboard all of Buddhism in order to say Shikantaza is the real thing, and that he's just made it up somehow, as is claimed in some places, that Dogen just kind of made up this thing about Shikantaza, and it doesn't really have anything to do with, traditional Buddhism. Dogen immediately offered a prostration and expressed gratitude for this teaching. Placing his hands in Shashu, he said, until today, I have not heard of an instruction such as the one you have just given me. Elders, experienced teachers, monks, and Dharma brothers here do not at all know this teaching. They have never spoken in this way. Today it is my good fortune to have received your great compassion. And he kind of goes, I'll edit it a little bit. He goes on to say how grateful he is. And I yet would like to ask you another question. Is there any secret method one can use to remove the five coverings or the six coverings? So the five coverings are the five hindrances to wisdom, or in Chinese, the Chinese lineage of Buddhism, they're explicitly talked about as hindrances to meditation. The six coverings are the five coverings. So it's, I'll talk about those a little bit more in just a second. But, the five hindrances are just hindrances to our awakening, the five sense desires plus ignorance. So our craving, goes back to like the Four Noble Truths. Our craving for sense desires, all of the five senses plus ignorance would be the six hindrances. So again, the point is that just talking about very basic Buddhist, teaching. So he asks, what is the secret to removing the five hindrances and the six coverings? And the teacher says, He smiled and said, "To what practice have you been devoting your entire energy? That practice is nothing other than the Dharma that removes the six coverings." The Buddhas and ancestors have not set up classifications in practice. They directly show us and singularly transmit the way to depart from the five desires and the six coverings, and the way to be free from the five desires. Putting one's effort into the practice of just sitting and dropping off body and mind is the way to depart from the five coverings and the five desires. This is the only method of being free from them. There is absolutely none other. How can there be that fall into two or three? So he's, we don't like this kind of thing when we hear it. Modern people like, this is the only way. And what he's talking about really, in my opinion, is what is said in the Lotus Sutra. So, and it's the reason that we don't like it is that we think, well, just the Zen school or just sitting shikantaza is dogma. It's the only way, and if you don't do it, you're not a Buddhist, or you're not, truly awakened. But when we really study what our zazen is, that's when we understand, I think, more what he's saying here. And our zazen is the reality, that includes everything. We call it reality, but it includes all other practices. It includes, everything we can understand, everything we can talk about. So I don't think, necessarily he's trying to, in my opinion, he's talking about some kind of exclusive practice here, but it's the same teaching in the Lotus Sutra that this one vehicle is, we can't make a distinction between the one vehicle, the practice that awakens to the one vehicle, and the person that is practicing. In that one vehicle or that one reality, there's no distinction between those things. And so we have to kind of make a mistake and say, this is the one vehicle, this is the only vehicle, or this is the only way, because of the limitations of of when we speak. Anything we say is kind of a problem. So that's the kind of thing I think that Rujing is really, saying here, rather than trying to set up a dogmatic view. So just talk a little bit about what he's saying here, and hopefully what it relates to our, our daily practice. So the five desires, as I was saying here before, are the desires based on each of our sense organs. So, in other words, the Buddha taught about the 18 elements, and how when some object of the sense organ meets the sense organ, some kind of reaction, some consciousness arises, and within that relationship, greed, hatred, and delusion arise. So he's talking about, the subject-object relationship. So in our zazen, we go beyond the subject-object relationship, is really what he's saying. And so, how do we do that? We can talk a little bit more about this in a minute, but what is the importance of that in our life? And it's, it's hugely important. So for one thing, just on a personal level, for example, where is all of our, suffering rooted in our life? And it's rooted in this particular person, and this particular person as the subject, and comparing itself, or setting up desire or aversion to other things. So when, for example, when we're at work, we think about ourselves in terms of our status at work. Are we a good employee? Are we smarter than the other people? Are we less smart than the other people? And according to how we evaluate that situation and the narrative that goes on in our head, we're either happy or unhappy. And so the problem is, of course, is that even if we feel superior or we feel that we've got to have the leg up in one situation, we know that in another situation we won't, or that it will change. Someone will come into the mix who is smarter than we are, or better looking, or younger, or more knowledgeable, or whatever it is that we base our narrative on. So all of our relationships really revolve around the subject-object relationship, or these boundaries that I spoke of last time. So, when we're out in the regular society, I'm a 60-year-old man now, and so I grew up to a certain part of my life really identifying with being a young man and going into a particular situation, and being happy that I was the youngest person there, maybe. Or, that's just one way that one can compare oneself to others and think that, they have the leg up, or something. And so I think young people tend to do this because, young people tend to be, have more energy. We value youth in this culture. We think that younger people look better. They have the fashion sense. They set the trends. They know all the cool music, and all the pop culture is geared towards them. And so often when we're young people, we really enjoy that and identify with that. And when I was young, I never really thought that I was going to get old. But there is actually, when you're young, you actually, it starts happening. It starts creeping up. Like, you're 21, suddenly you find yourself as 26, and then 7, and wait a minute, actually, I'm going to be 30 someday. And sooner or later, we lose that sense, of being the cool people in this culture, or whatever it might be. Some people might have the experience of not being cool, not, or being the uncool young person too. That's the other bad shadow of all of this too. Only certain traits are valued often in youth culture, I think. So anyway, not that I know at all what's going on in youth culture anymore, but when I was young, that was certainly the case. And so even though you might be at the height, at some point it will change, and somebody younger, somebody better looking, as I say, when you start comparing yourself with that person, you'll fall. You kind of fall from this heavenly realm. And it might be money or status, things that you have that you define yourself by, or that you identify as superior with others. So, you think about even the billionaires in our society, and there has to be a lot of energy that comes from just comparing oneself and saying, I'm one of the richest people ever, or I'm the richest person in the country right now, or one of them, or I'm much richer and have a lot more stuff than all of these people. Like, I'm in the top 5%. But, many things can happen to change that. And if nothing else, the old saying, the cliche goes, you can't take it with you, At some point, you're going to be maybe an 80-year-old man who might have, a lot of the wealth or 80-year-old woman or whatever, in the country, and you're facing your own death, and you can't help but think, well, what does this mean now? And we can think in terms of leaving a legacy, or all the things that you might have done. But if we haven't worked out this basic matter of life and death, none of that, comparing oneself to others, comparing yourself to others who are going to be living and you're going to be dead, even if you have all the money in the world, it doesn't, it doesn't solve this great suffering that has to happen when we haven't clarified the understanding of what this life is. So, and the other side of the coin, is that when we start seeing through the eyes of Zazen and we start seeing other people or other things not as objects, but as uh, parts of the self or the self. That's one way we can express it. We say everything is self, but we could, express it another way. But this is the way that, Dogen Zenji expressed it in this Jijuyu Zanmai, self-receiving and self-employing, samadhi. This self that encounters everything as self. So when we encounter someone who's better looking than us, or somebody who's younger or has more money, we don't have to be comparing, or we don't have to be jealous, or we don't have to wish bad for that person or beat ourselves up, because we understand that that is not an object. That other person is not an object to be scrutinized and evaluated by this person. We don't try to manipulate and use and compare. And it can be our source of joy to make some offering to help nurture this self, which includes nurturing those that we might otherwise think of as the other or the enemy. So we see some political party or some group of people that we think are no good because of their political views and even actions. When we try to, fight those people, that's very limited. You might win. That samsara says you might win for some point, but sooner or later you will lose. And rather than seeing those people as the enemy, we see them as part of one life that we're sharing. And then there might be another solution to these great difficulties, like actually listening and trying to understand why someone else has this other view, or what our part is in creating this friction or this difficulty. So it's very different, than just sort of waging war or actually trying to investigate the self, investigate others or phenomena as not as something to manipulate and control and put into my own particular view, but to expand my own understanding of this life. And, knowing that what's up here is just a tiny, tiny piece of this life, as we think that's the entirety of it. So in our Zazen, we're actively letting go of this, of what's going on up here, that subject-object relationship, actively letting that go. And that informs the rest of our life too, though. As I often say, and we talk about the three minds often, and that's the way we explicitly talk about bringing our Zazen into our other relationships off the cushion. And this comes back, to the self-receiving and self-employing or self-offering. It's the bodhisattva, it's the bodhisattva vow. So when we see everything as self rather than an object, we make some effort to make an offering, is one way we can put it, rather than get our own way. So an offering to nurture the self that includes us. All right. I wanted to read another part. So from Hokyoki, and I'm sorry about going on so long. There's so I'll probably have to talk about this again next time, but I wanted to keep going a little bit with what Rijing said about zazen and dropping off body and mind. So Rijing said, the zazen of arhats and pratyeka Buddhas is free of attachment, yes, yet it lacks great compassion. Their zazen is therefore different from the zazen of the Buddhas and ancestors. The zazen of Buddhas and ancestors places primary importance on great compassion and the vow to save all living beings. Non-Buddhist practitioners in India also practice zazen, yet they have the three sicknesses, namely attachment, mistaken views, and arrogance. Therefore, their zazen is different from the zazen of the Buddhas and ancestors. So again, and he talks about Shravakas here too. I think this sounds, kind of off to us these days, but I think, they're really talking about an attitude here rather than a particular group of people. So when we talk about the lesser vehicle, I think now we would clearly understand that we're not talking about a group of people as much as a certain attitude and practice. And the same thing with, Pratyeka Buddhas or arhats. It's a particular attitude. So he says Shravakas also practice zazen, and yet their compassion is weak because they don't penetrate the true reality of all beings with wisdom. They practice only to improve themselves, and in so doing cut off the seeds of Buddha. Therefore, their zazen is no different from the zazen of the Buddhas, is also different. Their zazen is also different from the zazen of the Buddhas and ancestors. In Buddhas and ancestors' zazen, they wish to gather all Buddha Dharma from the time they first arouse Bodhi mind. Buddhas and ancestors do not forget or abandon living beings in their zazen. They offer a heart of compassion even to an insect. Buddhas and ancestors vow to save all living beings and dedicate all the merit of their practice to all living beings. They therefore practice zazen within the world of desire. Yet even within the world of desire, they have the best connection with this Jambudvita. Buddhas and ancestors practice many virtues generation after generation and allow their minds to be flexible. Dogen made a prostration and then asked, what does allowing the mind to be flexible mean? Rijing said, affirming the dropping off of body and mind of the Buddhas and ancestors is the flexible mind. This is called the mind seal of the Buddhas and ancestors. And then it says, Dogen Zenji gave his teacher 6 prostrations. So, this flexible mind and the affirming of the Buddhas and ancestors, this is zazen itself. It's not a critical mind. It's not a mind of contention, or it's not a mind of fixing on some particular way that things have to be. But the flexible mind is itself, he says, awakening and and zazen itself, and the awakening, of the Buddhas and ancestors. So again, he's talking about it from the perspective of us, the people sitting. And, it's kind of interesting to hear him talk about it in this way. It's very important, because we tend to think of, Dogen Zenji as not speaking about our own liberation or what, the person sitting, not experiences, but engages with, in their zazen. But here it's very clear that he's talking about the liberation liberation in very, uh, traditional ways that Buddhism is taught. So I think maybe I should stop here. I want to talk about the five coverings too, and then what it means to sort of address our zazen in the context of, say, the 12-fold chain, or the in addition to the five skandhas, the 18 elements, and the Four Noble Truths. Just briefly talk about that. But maybe I'll wait till next time, since I'm going on here and going on. We lost a lot of time because of the stuff going on with Zoom. So I apologize for that, but yeah, I'll just stop here now and pick up next time. So, is there anything anybody wanted to say or any comments today?
I had a little question.
Yeah.
What you're saying the Hokyo, where the meetings between, or the records of the meetings between Dogen and his teacher. What portion of his writing, like, where would you find this?
Yeah, it's actually just its own standalone thing called Hokyoki, and I think in Enlightenment Unfolds, there's by Kaz Tanahashi. I think Hokyoki is in there, and it might be other places too. But it's just it's sort of an essay or a record that he wrote after he got back, and it's the only thing about it is he wrote it quite a while after he got back. So I think it might have been quite some time after he got back, but you should be able to find it in that book, Enlightenment Unfolds, if not somewhere else too. Yeah, you're welcome. Yoho, you had something?
Well, I just want to say thank you for explaining his mentality, kind of, and the progression of his thinking and learning of kind of these different ways of practicing. I think that it's while it's not that we're trying to be critical of the different ways of practice. I think you've made an important distinction between, the greater vehicle and the lesser vehicle kind of thing. Because I think it sounds like with Dogen, that was his first experience of realizing that there was this other way, and because he just hadn't experienced that yet, and so that's really cool to hear, that he went to China and had this, great encounter that just completely kind of blew his mind, and it resonated with him so deeply, that it's just like, I knew there was something else to this thing, like, because he just couldn't, he knew that, kind of like the Buddha. The Buddha, tried all these different things, and he's like, nope, that just doesn't feel quite it, yet, and so it's like I think it's so important that we keep searching until we really feel like, yeah, that's it, like, but you can't just have someone tell you, you have to connect with it and be like, yep, there it is. Like, I don't know, it's that intangible beyond thing that and I really enjoyed now that kind of connected, like, with Zazen. Yeah, there is nothing else to describe what it is. You literally have to peel everything else away. And that is that vehicle or that practice to do that. You're not thinking, you're not it's breathing, or it's the heart beating, or it's eating food. Like it's like you can't have one particular thing that says, well, this is life. It's everything. It's like, and so I feel like that doesn't that way you describe that is the enlightenment. It's not just that one thing. It's taking away everything and realizing and sitting in nothing to realize it's everything. Sorry, but thank you for that.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you for that comment and for those insights, because I think it's true. Yeah, because in other situations in our life, we're always, there's really no other situation where we really can just completely let go. And I think that's part of the point of what I'll talk about next time is, this time in Zazen where it's like, the no remainder. When we are in the world and when we're acting with people and we're doing things, we do have to um, encounter that subject object relationship in some way, on some level. But, and so I think we actually sort of break the chain of delusion in a different place, in Zazen than we do off of the cushion. I think it's sort of necessary. Otherwise, we couldn't, do anything. We couldn't talk, or we couldn't, interact with people or drive a car in an enlightened way. We can still do those things as an expression of awakening, but that's why I think Dogen Zenji really put this emphasis on sitting so much, is because that is the time where we really don't have to do any kind of interacting with the object, and we can allow that to seep into everything we do. And as you say, it includes everything, so we don't need to criticize or say that this is better, this practice is better than another practice, or that somehow it's more genuine, or there's nothing to defend or be jealous of, or say it's good or bad in this, beyond discrimination. So it's a very compassionate and open-hearted and flexible thing, I think, rather than a dogma that says our way or yours, or nothing. And then, and the other thing you said too is, to me, his record of that time with his teacher, it's much more, to me, sort of real and inspiring than the image of him, attaining enlightenment on the Ton in Zazen. Like, I don't know if you've ever seen that movie called Zen. It's a Japanese movie that talks about Dogen's life, and it's a pretty, I kind of, like the movie, but there was a scene in it where, Rujing hits somebody next to him with his slipper and says, "Don't you know that Zazen is dropping off body and mind? Why are you sleeping?" And then it actually shows Dogen like this big lotus uh, appearing underneath him like a big disc, and he goes twirling around up into the sky on the lotus flowers. And it's kind of a hokey thing, but I guess for a movie you have to get a little dramatic effect in there. Just sitting Zazen isn't so exciting and doesn't capture the eye so much. But anyway, for him, you really feel like you see the mind opening up, like the insight. Dogen Zenji never said there's no insight or there's no awakening, but you really feel in that particular situation that his mind is opening and he's seeing something in a different way than he ever had before, as you just said, and showing gratitude to his teacher, and making these prostrations. It's kind of an awakening experience, but it's not kensho. It's not like, he never says that I saw the entirety, you know what I mean? Like I saw the Buddha nature. Dogen Zenji just never thought that we could set up that subject-object relationship with Buddha nature. We can't see the nature because it is us. And that's really why he didn't like that term, I think. But he never said there's no awakening or there is an insight. And you see it, you see it in his own life. But for him, it's a continual, process. And for us, I think, a continual process. And sure, we might say, well, will this, on some relative level, we want to be a Buddha in order to save all beings, the way that a Buddha can. But when we look at realistically our limitations in this life, really what we can do is express Buddha right now. That was his emphasis. That is complete awakening, and we can keep doing it. He's really tough in that way, saying, yeah, you can express enlightenment, but keep doing it. You don't get to just coast after you express this awakening. And then if we do that, then the sort of relative seeds of what we do to take care of our life in the future and take care of the seeds, karmic seeds of the past, that takes care of itself if we're fully here and now taking care of the self as everything we encounter now. It's not that there's no enlightenment, but we understand that there's only here and now to express it. Anyway, but that's, a lot to talk about, and we'll talk a little bit more about this next time, I think. So, yeah. Okay, well, great. Well, thank you very much, everyone, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your weekend. And we'll do the verse, and then we can bow. So. May this merit extend universally to all, so that we, together with all beings, realize the Buddha way. Hey, beings are numberless. I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless. I vow to enter them. Buddha's way is unsurpassable. I vow to realize it.